Thanks. Thank you for inviting me. It's good to finally be here. As some of you may know, for the last almost 10 years, we've been so fortunate as to have a very good access to the Norwegian oil revenues through what's labeled a Center of Excellence. This Center of Excellence was founded to study the causes of wars, why do they start, how are they terminated, and how do they stay peaceful. 10 years after, there's a question, what do we know? So, what do we know? This is not a list of places that are more, or that offer a better place to be in November than Oslo. It's a list of the about 100 countries in the world that has had some kind of armed conflict since 1946. It's a very, very diverse set of countries. It's easier to see them on the map. And as you see, the gray spots are in a minority. More countries have had armed conflict over the last 50 years than haven't had conflict. There's a, is there a laser beam? Ah, there it is. There's a gray spot over here. There's some gray spots in Latin America. There's a small belt here, a belt of peace. Of course, there's this point here, which probably will alter its color. So, if we look at the number of years in conflict, we count each conflict year. That is, each year that one organization wages war against its government, and we add them together. We see a slightly different picture. Myanmar and India have almost a quarter of all conflict years together. And you might say India ain't a very conflict-ridden country. And it isn't, because all the conflict in India, or almost all the conflict in India, happens in the periphery, particularly in the northeast states, those states east of Bangladesh. And I may be so bold to say that it has been quite common among Indian governments to not care very much what happens out there. Myanmar is a different question. Myanmar is a question of a state that isn't capable of organizing any form of monopoly of violence. The government of Myanmar is, in some ways, just another warring faction. Then there are a couple of other so-called usual suspects: Ethiopia, the Philippines, Israel, Iraq, Colombia, Indonesia, Sudan, and Iran. These countries together have half of all the conflict that's been since 1946. Not half of all the casualties, but half of all the years we have observed that one group fights its government. So the distribution of conflict is highly unequal. Among the about 100 countries that I showed on the first page, the vast majority is up here, where, yes, they've had experience with conflict. That experience was brief and in many ways inconsequential. So, in what way are the red countries different from the gray countries? This is perhaps the most important question that our center has tried to answer. This is perhaps the most important question that our center has tried to answer. Well, it turns out we don't have very many answers. They are on average poorer, that we know. Conflict tends to happen in poor countries. It does happen in some rich countries too, but it tends to happen in poor countries. Why is this so? That we do not know. There are some theories for how these causal mechanisms work, but the test, which is to run a statistical test with country years, their annual income per capita, and the onset of conflict, is very far removed from the causal link underneath. It's somewhat akin to the test of throwing a woman out in the lake to see if she floats or not. Test the theory, is she a witch? We know also that they're larger, and here we think we have a good explanation. Larger countries just simply offer more opportunities for rebel organizations because of their size. There's a sort of an economy of scale here. More people means a higher likelihood of violence. Then there is a good number of statements that are still up for debate. Diversity. Is ethnic diversity a correlate of conflict? Some says yes, some says no. Again, we haven't got the ultimate test to distinguish between the two answers. There is one that has been developed where I work. The thesis that it's not democracy or autocracy that's the problem. It's the countries in between, the regimes that aren't so repressive that they will stamp out any form of rebellion at its very onset. Nor are they so affluent that people find it worthwhile to produce goods, consume goods, instead of become predators. We initially found very good results for this hypothesis. Then it turns out that there is a slight flaw in the operationalization of these two terms. The middle category, part of the definition of the middle category, is political violence. Collier and Huffler provide evidence that countries very reliant on primary commodity exports are more likely to see conflict. Again, people like James Farron take their data, do a couple of an additional analysis, remove some of the errors they made, and no more finding. That doesn't mean that the relationship isn't there, but it's still an open question. Then there's the question of climate change or climate-related variables. There's been a couple of very high-key publications lately that has claimed a strong link between climate change or warm temperature and climate. Particularly the Marshall-Burke et al. Study does not stand up to any form of scrutiny whatsoever. There is a recent paper in Nature claiming a link between El Niño cycles and violence. And also this study has some cracks that are about to be explored. El Niño cycles. So it's kind of cute. You may be aware of this, but the quantitative study of armed conflicts was pioneered by a British physicist called Lewis Fry Richardson. Fry Richardson pioneered another field as well, numerical weather forecast. So if it could be shown that the two actually are one and a single, that would make sense in the grand history. But I'm not sure it will be. Then there's the question of unequal distribution. Back in the 70s, this was taken as granted. It wasn't even tested. Based on Marxist thinking, this is almost true by definition. then people started testing it, and they found very little. And I'm biased here because on the other side of my kitchen table sits a person whose dissertation is on this topic. But following Francis Stewart of Oxford University and following, to some extent, Charles Tilley, it's not necessarily the distribution between individuals that's important. What is more important is when this and that meet up. That is, when some identity group perceive that they are have received a rotten deal because they are a member of this identity group. Francis Stewart calls this horizontal inequalities. And to date, the strong support for this hypothesis has not been refuted. But it's still early. So what do we know? Well, we know very little. We know that there is a bunch of variables together that we can label good living or happiness or having a good life variables, that when they all come together, they seem to be correlated with peace, and when they're all missing, they're correlated with lack of peace. Not taking up the discussion we had prior to lunch. There is an point one, it's unclear what is the theoretical explanation, and it is quite likely endogenous, but not necessarily endogenous. If any of you have read Steven Pinker's latest book, he makes a strong case for why this is not endogenous. Incidentally, he blames the invention of the printing press for the decline in violence. We know quite a lot of where conflict erupts. We know quite a lot of, for the next 20 years, it will not be a bold prediction to say that there will be armed conflict in Palestine. It's quite likely, but not necessarily true, that there will be another war in Congo. South Sudan, and this is, I'm afraid to say, no longer a prediction because of the events last week, I think it's fair to say that that country is now in a state of armed conflict. But a month ago, it wouldn't have been a bold prediction to say that that would happen. What we know very little about is when conflicts erupt. We might have a guess of where in a very long time frame. We won't know very little about the trigger mechanisms. And I've listed some triggers here. In my onset dataset, the one I use to analyze these triggers, I have, in the best of cases, 275 onsets. That just is not enough data to check all of these up against each other. So we're in the peculiar situation that we, from a certain perspective, hasn't got enough war to explain war. So here's one thing that we do know. We do know that the Second World War worked as a watershed in the conflict history. Some conflicts continued out of the Second World War. For instance, Burma spurred a good number of conflicts right after the end of the Second World War. The Baltic countries had armed conflict for a couple of years. Then we have Korea. Then we have the beginning of the independence wars. For the whole post-war period, the number of conflicts are increasing. And this at the same time as these good life variables, happy living variables, are increasing as well. This is a period of immense optimism in large parts of the world. oh yes, I should, sorry. This is not obvious. The red here is what we label minor conflicts. That is the armed conflicts where more than 25 people, but less than 1,000 people die per year. For instance, the troubles in Northern Ireland was a minor conflict. The blue area is the full-blown wars, where more than 1,000 people are killed per year. And this is part of the story, because in this period here, the rate of wars to minor conflicts there's much more minor conflict than wars, but still there is a good chunk of wars here. Fairly large blue belt. They're almost gone. And this at the same time as these good life variables, happy living variables are increasing as well. This is a period of immense optimism in large parts of the world. And there's a key, because the growth of these factors, while there is a clear growth, the world is becoming a better place to be from the eagle's eye, this is not equally distributed. And what happens during this period is, of course, also the Cold War. Conflicts start at a higher rate than they end. So we end up with more and more conflicts until the end of the Cold War. The end of the Cold War ended in a peak of conflicts, a good number of conflicts that erupted straight out of the Cold War. And then, all of a sudden it dropped. And this is one thing we know. The world has become a much more peaceful place, whatever definition of peace, over the last decade and a half. And if we look at the UN's predictions for how the underlying quality of life variables will continue to develop, we got something like this. This is, of course, not something that we know. This is something that we guess. The two things that we should keep in mind when we're looking at the trends of the last 60 years. Wars between countries have almost ceased to exist. Countries don't go to war against each other except in very special cases. The other is that the massive conflicts, those that kill thousands of people, are also diminishing very fast. And it's an interesting fact that if we look at this period here, nearly all the conflicts that are in the blue area are connected with the war on terror. So if let's just say that the hijackers were arrested on the airport, that September 11 didn't happen, what would this look like? I think it's fair to say that we would be at a much lower place on this graph at this moment. Yeah. So maybe in 2050, if our very optimistic predictions are correct, that we will get a lot closer to peace on Earth. And there are many reasons to suspect that this is wrong, and I am actually quite certain that it might not be here, but the level of armed conflict in 2050 will be lower than what it is today. The world is getting increasingly a good place to be for more and more people. We might not know exactly the causal mechanisms, but I believe very much, or rather, yes, I believe, that's the right word, I believe in this. But What I stopped believing in is this question. As I said, this was the question we started out with. What's the difference between the red countries and the gray countries? And that's not a question we got very many answers for. It's quite likely the wrong question. And many of you, I know I'm speaking to the choir here, but it's important to say this. Comparing countries is probably not the way forward. But a more important question is, what about all these other organizations that don't use violence? Why do some organizations decide that we've had it, we're going to stop what we're doing and we're going to start using violence? And why do other organizations stay within the normal political domain? The problems here is violence, not conflict. If we can understand organizations in a pre-violent society, maybe we can prevent violence from breaking out. Another issue is that rebel organization isn't a single concept. The difference between Al-Qaeda and the Sri Lankan rebel army, the ETTA, is enormous. The ETTA was very much a proto-state with a standing army that fought another army. It was possibly the last conventional civil war. Very often, these organizations are organized around a single person. For instance, the rebel organization in Angola collapsed soon after the death of Jonas Savimbi. Other organizations have proven to be able to change their leadership several times. Also, what we should not expect is that there is a good number of organizations that aren't governments, but participate in conflicts on the government side. Northern Ireland had a good number of these organizations, and it might be argued that the SS was a pro-government organization rather than part of the military apparatus. Another aspect of organizations is leadership and the choice of strategies in rebel organizations. This is very loosely understood today. There are case studies, but from these case studies, we have yet to get a mature theory of why some strategies are chosen in various different situations. We need to disaggregate, and we need to look at people. I've just listed some questions here. You guys are starting your PhD careers. It's your job to come up with the good questions. But some questions: why do people start a rebellion, and why do other people join these rebellions? I'm not going to stand at DIW and hold a lecture of micro studies. That would be, but looking at people's action would very much bridge this huge divide between theory and operationalized tests. What I will talk a lot about, and what I believe is one of the important avenues in the years to come, is organization. One thing is, how are rebellions organized? Organizations is the one of the avenues I think we should be going. Geographical disaggregation and locations is the other. It's very rarely the case that a civil war engulfs a whole country. Fighting is very often very local. And in the presence of this knowledge, is the presence of lootable resources correlated with conflict? You can't test that in a cross-country setting. You can't just put in conflict and diamonds in a regression model and interpret the results. This is Russia. It's conflict here. There's diamonds here. That makes this is gobbledygook. It should not be done, and it's rather unfortunate that this up until recently was the state of the literature. We have another strong finding in the cross-country literature is that mountainous terrain is a macro-correlate of conflict. That is, the mountainous terrains are positively associated with risk of conflict. But why? When we look at the event data sets, very few events take place in the mountains. So are these mountains then where the rebels hide when they're not fighting? Possibly, but we can't test that in a cross-country setup. That's a speculative statement. Another idea, and here's a case study from Burma, and which is quite provocative. But the claim is that it's not random who lives in remote areas. Different people have settled due to their ancestors' cultural habits. So if you don't like to be bossed around, you settle in a remote place. And particularly in Burma, in the valleys of Burma, the more stubborn, independent peoples have tended to settle further up in the valleys. And when these areas become difficult to live, they track down, and that's when violence erupts. I don't know this as a fact, but there's a case study that claims this. Again, we can't test this in a cross-country setup, but it can be tested in a localized setup using localized georeferenced data, and in this case, also microservice. And this is interesting. It is interesting in and of itself that mountainous terrains is associated with conflict, but it'll remain only interesting and not useful until we figure out why. Migration is another issue that's under-researched. The issue of local polarization and fractionalization, which of course is very well researched in India, but not on a global scale. Agricultural production is another thing, which is the failure of agricultural production can be very, very local. It's been used in several papers, both the rainfall as a proxy for both economic growth and agricultural shortfall. Sorry. But also agricultural output in itself. And the question seems to be, or the question is conflict more likely to happen outside of the harvest season? And the answer could be yes, but we don't know yet because this has so far only been tested on a country setup. And it's the local agricultural production variants will lead at different harvest times, different places of country. So this also has to be tested locally. All of these new questions demand new data. Collecting data on countries is easy, and that's possibly why we focus so much on the country level, because data has been abundant. The latest World Bank development indicators holds around 2,800 perfectly good variables that I can put into my regression with a minimum of effort. On the other hand, collecting data on rebel organizations is very, very difficult. A very nice thing about collecting data on countries is that we agree how many countries there are. So I can start out with a list of countries, and then I can collect for Afghanistan, Albania, Austria, Australia, and so forth downwards. I don't have to start out by actually creating the list of countries. How many rebel organizations are there in the world? How do you define a rebel organization? Is one faction of Ulimo in Liberia different from another faction, or should they be treated the same? When should they be treated as two different organizations? All of these decisions has to be made, and at this point in time, you will have to make them, because there is no standardization of this yet. Furthermore, we have the problem of the control group. Fair enough, for instance, the Uppsala Armed Conflict Data Project gives us a fairly comprehensive list of rebel organizations, but what about all the organizations that didn't use violence? We have no directory of political organizations or relevant political organizations yet. This is, I hope that I can come here at the closing seminar of TAMNEAC and say that, and now of course we have this data, and therefore we now know that we have to do this and this to end war. Maybe. Another problem is that access to sources is in some cases extremely difficult, and in other cases very, 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 very easy. You can go, I'm flying out tonight, and I'm adamant that I can go in the airport bookstore and buy a book about Al-Qaeda. Quite likely that book will be quite good, will be thoroughly researched, and well, it could be a good starting point for anyone interested in Al-Qaeda. Try to find any sources about the APAC movement in Iran that started a very short and thoroughly unsuccessful rebellion shortly after Khomeini had landed in Iran. You can search the internet, and I think you'll get 4 hits. And that's part of the problem. It's some organizations are extremely well covered, others are extremely poorly covered. And what do you get when you compare a almost perfectly precise piece of data with a totally crappy piece of data? Unfortunately, you get a crappy comparison. It's always the data quality of the poorest data point that decides the quality of your comparison. These are location of onsets. We've tried to find where did the first battle-related death occur in each of these conflicts. And this is for the time period 1946 to 2008. The dots are territorial conflicts, and the triangles are governmental conflicts. These data are already present. And here's another problem. We had the problem with the rebel organizations, that we have the rebel organizations, but we haven't got the comparison group. What's the comparison group of an onset? So we know, for instance, in Cuba, we know exactly where that civil war started. There is a monument where the first person fell. Castro and his group came with a ship someone had told the government that they were coming, so they were waiting for them. And on the 12th of December at 7 o'clock in the morning, the shooting started. So we know exactly where that happened. So what's the control group? Is it 500 meters down the beach? Is it the next island? Is it on the other side of the island? How do you compare an event to a non-event? Well, we need some kind of spatial containers. Some has used second-level administrative units, which is a perfectly good idea in some settings. In a very long time series, it's less of a good idea. For instance, Nigeria went from having 3 second-level administrative units to close to 50 today, which means that your unit of analysis will change over time. And in the end, it won't be a very good unit of analysis. A fairly good alternative is to use arbitrary units. We got a project that's about to be published, about to be released, where we've divided the world into grid cells. Each grid cell is 5 degrees times 5 degrees. Sorry, 0.5 degrees times 0.5 degrees, which is at equator is approximately 50 kilometers times 50 kilometers. And up where I was born, north of the Arctic Circle, isn't very large. But they're well defined, they're apolitical, and hence these units are exogenous to pretty much everything. It's not the definition of a grid cell is not due to war. It might be due to volcano eruptions, because we're covering the whole globe or if there is a patch of land present at the size of a football pitch. The consequence of which I'll show you soon. And they're stable over time. They don't change. So while these units may not be the easiest to communicate to policymakers, they make a lot of sense as units of analysis. This is the grid data structure of Southeast Asia. You can see Thailand. No, this is Burma, isn't it? Thailand, Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam, Malaysia, Indonesia, the Philippines. The last time you checked your map, you probably didn't see that you can walk from the Philippines down on Borneo. And of course you can't. This is an artifact of a number of very small islands around here that in total make up an area at the size of a football pitch, and hence they're gridded. The area in between sea is not gridded. That's just a decision we made to make the dataset a bit smaller. At the current stage, it takes us approximately 2 days to compute the whole dataset, and if we included C units as well, we would be well into a week. So what is it that takes time? Well, we put all these indicators into the PRIO grid. Demography, ethnic groups, natural resources, climate data, other environmental data, socioeconomic data, infrastructure. And then we do, at the end, we compute a large number of distances and spatial lags. So that all of this is ready-made. And how can you use this? Well, you can use this either by, if you have spatially georeferenced data, it's very easy to plug it into the grid. The grid structure comes with production-ready data merging capacity. Also, if you have event data, such as onsets, this gives us the reference groups we were missing. If an onset happens in this cell, then we can compare this cell to all the other cells. Then we have a comparison. So, to conclude, and I got 3 minutes, what we need to do as a field is first we need to get better facts. Right now, we have mostly data on country level, and that will not be what gives us the right answers in the future. And I'm very much, there are two schools here. There's a school that says we have to build theories, and then you'll have to go out and get the data once you got the theory. And then there is those of us that would like to first collect data. And once you got data, then you can start thinking about what the question you should have asked in the first place. And I'm not alone in this latter approach. Sherlock Holmes said, I cannot theorize without data. It's a Scandal in Bohemia, page 57. We need to ask new questions. And we need to do that based on better facts. And we need to communicate with the case study literature. There is a laughable gulf between people that do case studies on the one hand and people that do quantitative work on the other hand, where we mock and ridicule each other, and that's just now that is one of these no, not latent. It's the surface conflict. Surface conflict. We got the same goal, and we're just too proud to admit it. We need to integrate with the case study literature, and we need to. Those of us that do theoretical and empirical work have to communicate our empirical models in a way that makes sense to ordinary people. To put up a regression table with 17 digits after a comma that's not good enough anymore. We need to communicate our results visually and in natural language so that these people that haven't got years of training in econometrics can understand what we're doing. We need to focus on violence, not conflict. We need to get the empirical tests to test the theory rather than a shadow of the theory. And we need to involve policies and policymakers. We need to talk with policymakers to understand what kind of questions do they need answers to. And this isn't just because the relevant research might just help people. It's also because relevant research is what's fundable research. And on that note, thank you.